Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Mapping and Measuring Your Journey to DevOps. This is part 2 in a 3-part series, so for those of you who were here for the first part, thank you for joining us again. For those of you who weren't here, we're still confident that you're going to be getting something out of this, and you will be able to see recordings for both this session as well as a previous section in the follow-up email coming through. To let you know all up front, we are recording this session, and we also have a window for questions, which we will be doing a question and answer portion at the end. I would like to jump right in because we have a lot of ground to cover, so please welcome our presenter, Brian Dawson.
Hello, thanks for the introduction, Max, and thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce Tom McGonnell. He is one of my CloudBees colleagues, and he is a experienced senior DevOps consultant as well as an active member in the DevOps community. He will be helping in today's presentation as well as participating in the question and answer section of the webinar. So our agenda for today is to review what we call the Quadrants model. For those of you that were not able to
Brian, just real quick, if you can pause your screen.
For those of you that were not able to participate in part 1 of the series, in part 1 of the series we introduced a simplified model for discussing, measuring, and mapping your DevOps maturity. We will take a quick moment to review that again as part of this webinar. We'll then move into a real-world measuring and mapping example where we look at a Fortune 500 financial services company and we review how we went through the discovery, definition, and mapping process for their DevOps journey. We'll quickly review some high-level DevOps transformation strategies. We'll talk about what's next in our series, and then we'll review Q&A. Ultimately, I hope that for this webinar, you gain new inspiration on how to drive a DevOps transformation within your organization. So, quick introduction to myself. I am Brian Dawson. I work at CloudBees. My title is DevOps Evangelist, and I also serve as a product marketing manager for the Jenkins product. My career has spanned a number of domains in the software development process, from QA to development. I've always performed some level of sysadmin responsibilities, I think as a lot of us developers do today. I've also spent time in development management and project management. Overall, whether it be working on tools and middleware or graphics pipeline optimizations in the 90s, implementing collaboration or OSS practices in the enterprise in the early 2000s, or most recently consulting to help organizations achieve CI, CD, and DevOps. My career has largely or really always been focused on optimization of the software development process, be that on the culture, practices, or tools and technology planes. I'll do my corny joke, which you guys may have heard before, but I really do consider myself as practicing in knowledge redistribution. I say I'm a software or IT socialist, a bit of a Bernie Sanders with good hair. Now, throughout the course of this webinar, we will ask some poll questions, not only to better inform us, but so that you guys can get insights into what the other attendees to the webinar are doing or seeing, or what their perspective is. So we'll start with poll question number 1. The question is, what do you consider your role to be? Option 1 is developer. Option 2 is quality assurance. Option 3 is operations. Option 4 is you participate in some level of people or process management, be a program manager, a scrum master, a development manager. Or option 5, you consider yourself part of the business. The poll will remain open for approximately 30 seconds. Okay, so we have 16% that consider themselves to be developers. We have 0% reporting as being QA, 32% reporting as being part of operations, 42% as being part of people or process management, and 11% reporting as being part of the business. And I would guess that if we opened it up to sort of all of the above, based on my experience, we would find some people that would identify themselves as all of the above, or what we call full stack. I do find it encouraging that this is actually people that apparently are responsible for process and probably driving the transformation that are participating. And I love the fact that we have 11% registering as part of the business, because one of the things that we will discuss, and we have discussed in the past, is that a DevOps transformation really is not just development and operations, but rather it spans the entire SDLC, which includes both your business and ultimately your end users or customers. Okay, so we'll go ahead and proceed. So next, we'll review what we call the DevOps maturity quadrants, or the 4 quadrants of DevOps maturity. What the quadrants model is a simplified model that enables you to more easily discuss the state of your DevOps maturity, assess that maturity, and then measure and map that maturity such that you can drive and monitor a DevOps transformation. The model is intentionally simplified, or what I would call reductive in a positive sense, and it's couched in the idea that oftentimes when we look to embark on what could be a complex enterprise-wide transformation to a process such as DevOps, it benefits us if we simplify the problem space, then map out our journey through the problem space so we avoid analysis paralysis of sorts, or we avoid getting in a situation where the problem space is so complex that it hinders our ability to progress or move forward. This simplified model presents 4 quadrants in the context of a matrix. For the x-axis of that matrix, we divide your standard SDLC from define to operate, or what I often call concept to customer, into upstream and downstream processes. Oftentimes we find that when we look to parse the SDLC out this way, that there are a number of organizations that are currently practicing Agile upstream, but then only a subset of those organizations are able to practice Agile downstream, where they are applying Agile project management and execution principles to test, release, deploy, and ultimately operation. On the y-axis of our quadrants, we split this by levels of adoption or levels of penetration of a given practice. So in generic terms, we segment this by team, i.e. one or a few teams practice, in this case, Agile upstream and or Agile downstream, to work group or business unit, where one or a few work groups or business units implement these practices, all the way through to enterprise, where we specify that we are practicing either Agile upstream or Agile upstream and Agile downstream, i.e. enterprise DevOps at an enterprise level. And one thing that we'll note when we look at this breakdown of the current market is that only 10% of organizations claim to have achieved enterprise DevOps, i.e. within this definition, where they are applying Agile or continuous principles upstream and downstream across work groups or at enterprise level. So we do talk about, why do we divide it in this way? Well, one, because as we see by the statistics, this dividing line sort of draws where we're seeing major differences, i.e. 33% versus 13%, 33% versus 22%, and ultimately 33% of organizations that practice Agile upstream, but only a small subset of those that are practicing enterprise DevOps. And also, we want to look at, well, what's the value of enterprise DevOps? What are those 10% practicing enterprise DevOps recognizing? Well, what's been evidenced by companies in the market that has successfully implemented enterprise DevOps is that they're enabled to innovate faster, which enables them to respond to market conditions, whether that be competitive challenges, new technologies, or security issues or defects. By being able to do that, they can gain competitive advantage. Also, what we find is by revisiting and optimizing our software development practices in pursuit of DevOps, we're able to recognize increased productivity, so we can see more throughput for the same amount of effort. And then something that I always like to revisit that I think is often under-focused on, but a lot of my customers have mentioned, is that as an objective, is that you also tend to see increased employee satisfaction. We tend to see that our developers, or what I like to call development process participants, be that developers, be that operations engineers, or be that QA engineers, tend to be more productive. They're able to innovate more. They're able to leverage modern practices, and therefore your current employees tend to stay, as well as you're able to attract additional talent due to the fact that you guys have achieved and are able to provide these benefits, such as innovation, increased productivity, less firefighting, etc. Okay. We also talk about the need to connect upstream and downstream and work group and enterprise on all of the planes of what I call the DevOps Trinity. That's people, process, and tools, or you can otherwise describe it as culture, practices, and technology. So why haven't we all achieved this? Because there tends to be a chasm between upstream and downstream, and really ultimately team and enterprise that are challenging to cross on these planes. So one of the things that we look to do by segmenting the problem space into 4 quadrants is to better enable you to parse out and then ultimately cross these chasms to connect upstream and downstream, team, work group, and enterprise on the planes of people, process, and tools, or culture, practice, and technology. So what we've done, now that we sort of identified the market conditions, identified dividers for each of our axes, we now identify quadrants. Quadrant 1 represents team level Agile, i.e. your team or teams practice some level of Agile practices, be that Kanban, be that Scrum. Quadrant 2 is team level continuous delivery. In Quadrant 2, we've now progressed to where one or more of our teams are able to continuously deliver from definition or plan through to deploy or operate. Quadrant 3 is Enterprise Agile. It's where our organization has scaled their Agile project planning and execution practices across the organization. And then Quadrant 4 is what we call Enterprise DevOps. That's where, as a matter of practice, your teams are able to continuously deliver and or continuously deploy from definition to operate, concept to customer. And your organization has adopted a culture of collaboration, experimentation, and learning as aligned with Agile principles. So we'll take a moment for another poll. Poll question 2 is based on our review of the quadrants. Which quadrant are you in? Quadrant 1, you guys currently practice team level Agile. Quadrant 2, you practice team level CD. Quadrant 3, you practice enterprise Agile. Quadrant 4, you practice enterprise DevOps, or none of the above. We'll keep the poll open for approximately another 30 seconds. Okay, and the results are in. This is very interesting. So we have an even split. 27% see themselves as being in Quadrant 1, 27% in Quadrant 2, 27% in Quadrant 3, and then 15% have reached Quadrant 4, which is higher than what we've identified as the industry average. And then 4 are what I call are in what I call Quadrant 0. They apparently have not moved into any of the quadrants. So that's interesting. We'll go ahead and then compare these poll results with our poll results from part 1 of this webinar series, which themselves aligned very well with what my experience has been, what the analyst report and what the analyst reports identified. There we identified that roughly 82% of the respondents practice Agile, 68% continuous integration, 34% continuous delivery, and 45% felt they practiced DevOps, which aligned very well with what we saw in the breakdown of our 4 quadrants. We found that a number of our attendees were still investigating DevOps. Some had gone beyond investigating and had the knowledge to plan their route, had the knowledge necessary to plan their route, and others were currently taking the journey. Again, a very small percent said they had just arrived. And then in contrast to what we saw today, we did see that the majority of our attendees were in Quadrant 1, or I beg to say we're stuck in Quadrant 1 and working to cross the chasms from Quadrant 1 to Quadrant 2, and then ultimately scale up to be part of that 10%, and then eventually more that were practicing enterprise DevOps in Quadrant 4. Okay, well, for those that are still trying to get to Quadrant 4 or beyond Quadrant 1, Quadrants 1 and 2, we'll walk through a real-world example of using the quadrants to measure and map your DevOps journey or your DevOps transformation. This example is based on a real-world financial services company with which I did some consulting work to help facilitate their transformation. This company provides a number of well-known Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies a large-scale accounting platform. Their business used to be based on shipping a disk or using professional services to go out and do an install. At the point that we engaged, their business had shifted to being 65% SaaS, and they anticipated that that would increase. This prompted them to want to pursue better methods of delivering their software to capitalize on the shift to SaaS business. They also had observed some difficulties in their current working world. So at the time that we engaged, they had already began to practice Scrum in development as a standard practice. They had been doing so for about a year, which would then put them in Quadrant 1. However, they practiced Waterfall in operations and QA teams. So there was an existing disconnect between the rate at which the development or app dev was ready to deliver versus the cadence or rate at which QA and operations could accept the results of that work. They had 6-month releases, so even though they were developing in 2-week sprints, the disconnect between app devs methodologies and the downstream methodologies limited them to at best a 6-month release cycle, though they did have monthly maintenance releases using Kanban that set the stage for us to be able to connect their upstream and downstream. Their servers were all virtual machine based, so they had the ability to elastically provision. However, access to those were gated by operations and requested via a legacy ticketing system. Development, QA, and operations all leveraged the best of breed solutions for their particular group, and in this case it became a tool silo as opposed to having an integrated tool chain. And the team, especially operations, experienced excessive firefighting and burnout. So not only did they have their long-term plan, their tasks that were planned via their waterfall, in fact, PMBOK process, but they had to deal with late stream delivery of an application that was developed by app dev in an agile manner. This resulted in firefighting, and it also resulted in a high number of severity 1 production issues. So it's all of these attributes and issues that the company experienced that prompted them to want to pursue a better way of doing things, and their objective was to ultimately implement a DevOps culture, principle, and practices couched in first establishing continuous delivery as a standard or unifying practice. Okay. So this gives us a chance to review our order of operations with this particular organization, as well as what I recommend as a default order of operations. When we talk about simplifying your DevOps transformation, it really is about answering the questions, where are we today? Where are we going? And then figuring out a pragmatic as opposed to a dogmatic way to get there. And then, of course, acknowledging that we will continuously improve, we will empirically learn, we will apply those empirical learnings, rinse and repeat. So the where are we gets answered with what I call your discovery process, which is critical, right? You need to determine your current state. What does our organization do well today? What did we do poorly? Use that to then sort of quantify your maturity. Next, where are we going? You need to define or establish the objectives that are best fit for your organization. This is again where I say don't seek to dogmatically adopt what the quote-unquote experts in the market say you must do in order to be DevOps. Understand that continuous deployment, for instance, may not be best for your customer base. In this particular case, we had SaaS customers of a large-scale accounting platform. They needed to audit and accept and approve every change that came in the software. They therefore weren't able to accept continuous deployment as an option, for instance. It's also important that when you go through discovery and definition, you involve and align all stakeholders. Then at that point, when our stakeholders can agree on what issues we experience, we're aligned on shared objectives, we can then begin to answer the question of how do we get there. That's where we map our journey through our 4 quadrants of DevOps maturity, and then we embark on crossing the chasms, connecting our quadrants, and then, as I said, continuously improving. So let's take a quick, albeit simplified, look at the discovery phase. With this particular organization, we broke down our discovery by our quadrants and what we identified as characteristics of an organization that is mature in a given quadrant. So for quadrant 1, we ask a series of questions such as, do one or more teams practice Agile? For this organization, the answer was yes. Do teams practice continuous integration? For this organization, while a few of the Scrum teams had implemented some level of continuous integration or automated build, we'd say it wasn't true continuous integration with full validation, and it wasn't standard across any significant number of teams. We then ask, are end user needs defined and planned using Agile methodologies, right-sized for iterative and continuous delivery? And the answer for this organization was partially. They use water, scrum, fall. So the business would still define customer needs or end user needs in a very monolithic waterfall way using a large comprehensive requirements document. They would then decompose those into epics and ultimately stories that then would be assigned to the multiple Scrum teams. They would develop using an iterative methodology, Scrum in this case, and then at the end of a given number of sprints, they would take a big bang release, wrap it up, and hand it to QA. So while they had some level of Agile, they weren't truly meeting the definition of a fully Agile Quadrant 1. In addition to asking other questions around Quadrant 1 maturity, we then move over to Quadrant 2, team level CD, and we ask questions such as, are one or more teams able to dynamically provision production-like environments? The answer in this case was yes. But then as we delve a little deeper and we ask, are your environments and infrastructure versioned and or treated as code so that they are repeatable and you don't rely on manual human-driven processes? The answer was no. Is the operations team involved in the sprint, iteration, or release planning process? For this organization, the answer was no. We then carry forward and we ask questions in Quadrant 3, Enterprise Agile, questions that would speak to characteristics of an organization that is managed to scale their upstream processes across the organization. We find that do all teams follow shared Agile practices? There was a positive answer of yes for this organization. Do teams use common integrated definition, planning, and development tools? Yes. But unfortunately, in this particular organization, they practice water, scrum, fall. So they implemented scrum or iterative development within their teams. But again, the business was not aligned with iterative development. And they had also not unified their tools such that it would be easily unified their tools and actually practices such that it would be easy to report on status and performance across teams. We move to Quadrant 4. We ask a similar set of questions. Does your organization provide elastic infrastructure as a service? No. Are your business and customers aligned with Agile and continuous delivery of changes? I.e., have you moved from water, scrum, fall? And are you an Agile organization from concept to customer? The answer is no. So based on asking these questions, out of our discovery process, we're able to identify the current maturity of the organization by quadrant. Okay, and it's important to note, I gave you an example of the questions that we would ask and that we have asked. If you are interested in getting more detailed examples of the questions, I'll provide contact information at the end of this presentation, and you can reach out to me and I can provide you some more detailed examples. But really, when you look to decide what questions or surveys you will ask, you want to do a couple of things. One is you want to focus on your 10 to 20 high-level priority questions that define maturity in a given quadrant based on the pragmatic definition of your organization's needs. And you want to make sure that you ask those questions, even the obvious ones, of multiple teams and multiple stakeholders in the process. I.e., you need to involve the business, you need to involve development, you need to involve QA, operations, and management. Sometimes asking what are obvious or seemingly redundant questions. Okay. For this particular organization, we arrived at the realization that they were very mature in Quadrant 1, yet they were really low, had a low level of maturity in Quadrant 2, i.e. the operations team had adopted virtual infrastructure, however, they couldn't scale it on demand. The operations team was moving towards versioning all of their scripts and adopting modern downstream practices, However, those practices weren't connected to or consistent with the delivery or the development process that was happening in Quadrant 1. Quadrant 3, they had a medium level of maturity. They had managed to scale their agile project planning and execution practices across the organization. However, they did not extend those agile practices to the business. And Quadrant 4, our enterprise DevOps quadrant, their maturity was very low, and that really ended up being a factor of a medium level of maturity in Quadrant 3, a low level of maturity in Quadrant 2. Okay. So with that enabled us to sit down and establish first long-term or strategic objectives. So ultimately, we want to move to a space where we can release all applications every 2 weeks. Now, for given single-tenant architectures in the software as a service platform, we may not actually deploy the update every 2 weeks. But we're in a situation where we can deliver release-ready software fully tested and functionally validated every 2 weeks. We want to reduce Sev1 defects by 100%. We no longer should ever experience an outage on deployment to production. And this may seem like a lofty goal, but it's entirely realistic if they've managed to achieve parity or a high level of parity in their development environments, test environments, stage environments, and production environments. And they adopt something such as blue-green deployments to roll out to their prod servers. They wanted to reduce all defects by greater than 50%. They wanted to reduce operations and developer overtime by 80%, i.e. increase quality of life for their employees, reduce overall IT cost by being more productive, managing fewer forks of the code, delivering changes more rapidly, and spending less time doing regression, defect correction, and firefighting. And then ultimately, they wanted to be able to increase their responsiveness to the customer. So being that they now had this platform of SaaS through which they can deliver, they needed to shift their methodologies from those that were developed when they were shipping on CDs once a year to be able to respond to the customer and deliver them value more rapidly based on the fact that they were delivering to a SaaS platform. With this, they looked at a few high-level, short-term, what I call tactical objectives. That's one, they were going to establish a shared continuous delivery as a service platform. Two, they would implement automated testing for all applications. There was a recognition that they wouldn't achieve 100% automated functional testing across all applications, but they would start on that path, growing from their already established automated testing and automated test group that lived as an extension to what we would call their manual test or regression test group, and they would aggressively focus on gradually over time increasing the level of test coverage on all of their applications. Next, they would immediately begin to form cross-functional teams, i.e. they would fully incorporate not only developers and QA representatives, but also operations representatives on the Scrum teams, so that operations needs and concerns were addressed upfront in the planning process, and it was no longer the throw it over the wall mentality. And then through creating these cross-functional teams, aligning stakeholders, and consistently communicating, they would foster a collaborative culture. Okay? So they took those objectives, and with those objectives, they were then able to map their journey through the quadrants. And we've given some examples of steps that they took to navigate the quadrants the way they saw fit. So they first wanted to connect Quadrant 1 to Quadrant 2 and start by establishing team-level continuous delivery, i.e. individual teams would be enabled to implement continuous delivery practices using what would ultimately become a shared continuous delivery as a service platform with support for dynamic environment provisioning and automated testing, allowing them to go from definition ultimately to release continuously. They would form cross-functional teams to support that and provide for open communication and shared knowledge, which would then take them to a place ultimately where they'd have a high level of maturity in team level to work group level Agile and a high level of maturity in team level or work group level CD. So they could therefore cross the chasms at that level. They then would look to move from Quadrant 2 up to Quadrant 3 and 4 simultaneously, first focusing on, as we see starred here, on Quadrant 3 maturity, and there they would look to establish shared project management and development tools and practices, i.e. they would have common, sort of lowest common denominator ways of running their Agile teams, of capturing their Agile requirements and consistent tools. And while they would support some deviation across teams, they worked heavily to ensure that the core parts of those processes were aligned, and they required that there was some level of shared tooling to provide cross-team visibility. They also began to adopt enterprise infrastructure and CD as a service strategy. So shifting away from the gated access to virtual machines and moving to the ability to provide CD as a service platform, but also will allow those that are subscribing to their CD as a service platform to rapidly and dynamically provision infrastructure from an elastic environment, as opposed to having to manually request through a ticketing system. Then going from Quadrants 2 to 3 with a focus on Quadrants 4, they look to take their 1 to 2 initial teams, that which I call their red team, and we'll discuss a little bit more, and then scale those lessons learned from that team gradually across multiple teams. So now this team level CD that would start off as a one-off team level practice would then be codified across multiple teams as a DevOps center of excellence or a standard process or practice. And then they would continually onboard the new teams, integrate those new teams in the common tools and processes, and then continuously and pragmatically work to improve and refine the shared infrastructure and practices while facilitating or encouraging a collaborative, learning-oriented culture across the entire organization. Okay? And with that, at the time that we last worked with the customer to apply these quadrants and define this plan, they were well on the way to achieving a high level of maturity in all of Quadrants 1, Quadrants 2, Quadrant 3, and Quadrant 4, such that they were able to achieve an enterprise DevOps state. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to ask you guys another poll question, and that is, where did or would you start with your DevOps transformation process? 1, would you start with culture, i.e. transforming your culture to bring people along? Would you start with implementing a given set of processes or practices? Or would you start with tools and technology? Or lastly, none of the above? And we'll leave the poll open for approximately another 30 seconds. Okay, interesting. So this is sort of an off-debated subject that we'll talk a bit more about when we move into transformation strategies. But what our poll results show us is that 42% would start with culture, 13% would start with process, and an amount about equal to the culture would start with tools and technology. As we discussed on webinar one, I will say there is no singular answer. And as I will always say, you cannot successfully transform an organization by only attacking one or two of these planes. So it is equally important to address culture, tools and technology, and ultimately process. But based on experience, I see it as being a toggle sort of approach. And we'll dig into that under transformation strategies. We can go ahead and clear the poll now. Okay. So when we talk transformation strategies, I think it's important first to transform incrementally. Okay. Well, we now are moving into a time where oftentimes our CIOs or maybe even our CEOs are recognizing that by adopting modern methodologies, i.e. DevOps principles, we can be more competitive as an organization. And we're getting C-level support. However, it is important that you don't attempt a mandated big bang approach from top down. Part of the process requires that there's a given alignment of culture, process, tools, and technology. And it's often best to start that incrementally with a pilot team. That pilot team can be an existing team, or it can be a new team that you will form around a given pilot project. For your pilot project, I would recommend that you focus on high value yet low risk projects, like a release of a new mobile application, an extension to our non-critical portion of our web presence. Make sure that that team is cross-functional. I call that team a red team, borrowing from DevSecOps or from security teams, in the sense that a red team, like a security red team, is challenging a company's strategy and preconceived notions around process and delivery. Now, we do get to this question of tools and technology or culture. And to a bit, I think it's both. By forming a cross-functional red team that is enabled to innovate and enabled to collaborate, you're starting to foster or affect culture such that it shifts towards being more collaborative. But I do believe it's important to establish a tools and technology backbone or an orchestration backbone for what will be these unified processes or unified practices. Specifically, I believe that continuous delivery and continuous delivery as a service provides a tools and technology as well as a process foundation for crossing your upstream and downstream chasms, and therefore then enabling you to build upon that to further influence practice and culture from team to work group to enterprise. Once you've established those unified technologies, build out a plan with measurable KPIs and milestones, as we saw with our example. Some may be obvious. We want to see a cycle time of 2 weeks from concept to release. We want to see a reduction in defects of greater than 50%. And then some of them may be less obvious, such as we want to measure employee overtime and employee satisfaction. A recent customer of ours that we did a seminar with had actually had an ongoing poll that the organization did to measure employee satisfaction, and they found that by adopting continuous delivery practices in pursuit of DevOps principles, that within a matter of months, they saw a 15% increase in employee satisfaction. Okay. Once you've done these things, go. Don't overcomplicate things. Don't wait for things to be perfect. Build a foundation to allow you to start to make progress and then make that progress. You will not know everything from the onset. As you go, you'll need to measure. You'll need to document your successes and failures, report those widely and freely to management, across teams, and of course within your team, and then learn based on those successes and failures and refine. Okay? Ultimately, by following these steps, you'll be well on your way to a DevOps transformation and being one of those few that have managed to reach Quadrant 4, or what we call Enterprise DevOps, and recognize the benefits of Enterprise DevOps. So before we get into our questions and answers, I just want to remind everybody that this is part of a multi-part series couched in the 4 Quadrants of DevOps Maturity. Part 1 was the introduction to the quadrants. That was held on May 4th. You can watch the recording at the URL that you see on the screen here. This was part 2, where we reviewed an example of mapping and measuring your journey to DevOps. A recording a link to the recording will be sent in the follow-up email. And then on July 7th, we'll present part 3. We'll crossing the DevOps chasms with tools and technology. We'll delve further into this tools and technology as a unifying platform and present practical strategies for implementing that unifying platform. And you can register for that event at the URL that you see here on the screen. Okay, with that, we can open up for questions. And also note that if you're not able to get your question answered here, you can always direct message me on Twitter at Brian V. Dawson. You can email me at bdawson@cloudbees.com, or you can always email info@cloudbees.com with further questions.
Hi, Brian. This is Tom McGonigal from CloudBees. What a great presentation. Thank you very much for presenting. And we, at this point, don't have any questions from the audience. And so I wanted to, my role is to field the questions from the audience and then get them fed to Brian. So if anyone in the audience has any questions at this time, please use the GoToWebinar control panel. And there's a questions box, and then you can go in there and start asking questions. But in the meantime, Brian, I did actually have a series of questions that I wrote up myself, and I guess I'm going to work from backwards to forwards in the presentation, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
And so one of my first questions was that I was very interested in was your transformation strategy slide, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on identifying a good pilot project.
Yeah, so first I'll agree, Tom. One is that it's a great question. Two is I'll do my best to answer it. And also be very interested in you sharing your thoughts with me and the audience. But the key things that I would state are when you look to identify a pilot project, it is very important that you don't pick your highest risk, most complex project. So if, say, your core business is delivering a CRM platform for your customers, and that platform, for instance, is architected as a large monolithic application, so it's not easy to decompose parts, I would not start there, because you can't accommodate experimentation or failures against that system. A failure will affect your entire business. Now, if you are that organization that delivers a CRM and you are planning to deliver a new iOS application, that iOS application could be a perfect pilot project for these practices. So minimize risk. Try to focus on a project that provides high value. It's also important to note that when your objective is to ultimately scale these practices across your entire organization, you want to look for a project that has as much of a representation of other teams as possible while still meeting the criteria of being low risk, high value, low complexity. And then lastly, you really want to look at the members of the team, of the pilot team. Hopefully they're people that are good collaborators. They are people that are inspired by innovation. And one or more or an aggregate of the team members have a cross-functional awareness and skill set. The reason for this is these guys have to be driven to go out and research new practices and technologies. They have to have the skill set to apply those, and they have to be able to collaborate and communicate such that they can share those learnings on an ongoing basis across other teams while you guys look to scale it across your organization.
No, that's really terrific. So you kind of dipped into my secondary question, which was how do you pick a good red team? But you really kind of hit the nail on the head, where you're looking for a team of innovators, essentially. Am I characterizing what you said correctly?
Yes, absolutely. I would say, collaborators, innovators, collaborators, and communicators.
Innovators, collaborators, and communicators. That's great. I'm going to write that down. Moving on to another question, I found our poll number 3 to be very interesting, and this is the one that was almost 50-50 split between where did you start your DevOps transformation, and it's 50-50 split between culture and tools and technology. I was surprised that so many of our listeners, our viewers, excuse me, are attacking culture first. Did you have a similar reaction to that?
Yeah, no. So yes, I was surprised, and I'd say somewhat encouraged, right? In the sense that we're at a time where I think all too often there are people that consider themselves DevOps engineers or DevOps organizations wholly because they have tackled the problem on a tools plane, i.e. they're using infrastructure as code in dynamically provisioned environments, for instance. Right? So it is encouraging that there is a focus on culture, yet it is also surprising because I also find that while culture is absolutely critical, that is the most difficult thing to change, and very difficult to change from the onset without some supporting process, tools, or technology. Now, Tom, I'd actually like to ask you, because I know that you are really, I think, what we call a full stack person. I do think that you've sort of come from the agile downstream or from the right, driving practices to the left. I'm curious, what's your take on culture versus process versus tools?
Well, I tell you, Brian, one thing that one of your slides that really spoke to me today was, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm just going off my notes, I apologize, but it was establish objectives are the short-term tactical objectives applicable to other organizations. And in it, you specify to foster collaborative culture. And as part of that, we have to have organizations have to move towards blame-free cultures. They have to start using tools like chat ops to facilitate coordination and collaboration. The list goes on and on. But it's really about a collaborative culture. And a metaphor I've written on the CloudBees blog. I've written 5 metaphors for DevOps, and they range from football, American football, to crew, to barn raising, believe it or not, to other ones. But my American football one, if you imagine a DevOps team as a team of football players all moving forward, they're all doing their own specific job. The guard is blocking the defensive tackle, and the quarterback is trying to move the ball to the halfback or whatever it is. But everyone's moving the ball forward together as a team, as a there's a collaboration, there's a coordination, and a movement forward of the project itself. And it's something that really spoke to me today in your presentation, your webinar. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that. And I'll just respond before we go to onto the next question, that there are two interesting points you made. That while we want to foster a collaborative culture, there's a tool. There are tools that say enable chat ops, right? So oftentimes it's not one or the other. It's not culture or tools. It is both, right? Tools enabling culture, and culture benefiting from those tools. I also love your sports analogies. I would encourage everybody to go look at the blog. I myself am a lacrosse fan, so I often use lacrosse as an analogy for the same thing. But yeah,
lacrosse is a great example. That's a great one. So we do actually have a question from the audience, and the question is, I think this is I don't know the answer to it, but I think it's a good question. And it is, are there any sample survey questions that that one of our listeners or one of our viewers could use within their organization? Do we have a questionnaire that they could use to map their own quadrant, where they are in the quadrants?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a two-part answer to that. I do absolutely have some sample survey questions that I have used that go beyond the 4 or 5 we mentioned here, that I have used in my career, and we've used at CloudBees in engaging with customers. So if you reach out to me, I can provide you examples of those. And then moving forward, we will be releasing a survey, a more comprehensive survey that you can use to measure your maturity, as well as you can help to drive a transformation within your organization. So reach out to me for what we have available today, and then stay tuned for a more comprehensive set of tools and collateral that you can use in practice.
Terrific. That's great news. And this is another question from the audience, and it is there a particular order we should implement DevOps in? And there was an order of operations slide in your presentation, and I feel I would point the viewer to that order of operations. And that order of operations was discover, define, map, and cross chasms. Would you agree that that's the approach that we at CloudBees are espousing?
Yeah, so I would agree that and I'm trying to characterize sort of the domain there, that order of operations represents how you want to tackle the problem. Now, I think another aspect of that question is going to be, well, for instance, do we start in quadrant 2 by providing elastic infrastructure? Do we start by having unified agile technology, etc.? You actually can start your transformation from quadrant 1, quadrant 2, really quadrant 3 or quadrant 4. In part 1 of this series, we did talk about common adoption patterns, and I referenced what I see as being the predominant and preferred adoption pattern. So for specifics, please reference back to the link that I showed earlier, view the recording, and download the slide deck. Specifically, I recommend that well, first, pragmatically, you start with where you with the path of least resistance. So start with where you have the most traction. If you have implemented continuous integration at a team level, then maybe look to next extend continuous integration to continuous delivery to give you that first crossover from quadrant 1 to quadrant 2. But generally, I would say transform incrementally at a team level, starting from left, saying you were greenfield, starting from left, going to right, ensuring that your definition and your plan is right-sized for incremental and continuous delivery. You can then push through to implementation of CI, extend that to implementation of CD, and then look to scale that across teams.
Terrific. That's a great answer. I think we have time for one more question. We are a little bit past the hour, but it's a question that I would like to ask you, and it's related to the chasms slide, which is kind of near the beginning of the presentation. And you know, what or how does one cross that chasm? What is there a panacea? Is there a medicine? Is there a pill? that that the one thing is it a culture of communication? Is it a blame-free culture? Is it having the right tools? Is there a way to cross the chasm with the most likelihood of success?
Okay. So my first answer is going to be absolutely no. There's no panacea, no magic pill, no silver bullet. Right. However, right, and I emphasize that because there will be a number of people telling you that there is a magic bullet, right? Adopt tool X, an application release and automation solution, and you will be DevOps. You will cross the chasm. But what I will say is that based on my experience and experience talking to colleagues, that one of the fastest ways to begin to across the chasm is, again, to adopt continuous delivery as a service, because it provides you a tools platform that values automation, and then a process that requires collaboration. So by establishing continuous delivery as a service, you directly cross the chasms on the plane of tools. You begin to cross the chasms on the planes of process, and you set the stage for implementing a culture of collaboration.
That's very well said. I totally agree with that. That really crystallized that in my mind. Thank you, Brian.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brian and Tom. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. That was a very informative session. Again, you will be receiving an email in a day or two with the slides and the recording, as well as a link to sign up for the next part should you choose. And we look forward to seeing you then.
All righty. Thank you.